Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue à votre rendez-vous du vendredi, les webinaires du RISC. Nous sommes très heureux de vous accueillir et puis si c'est la première fois pour vous, on vous souhaite les bienvenus. Comme vous l'avez vu dans nos annonces aujourd'hui, notre webinaire il sera donné en anglais. Comme on le disait un peu tout à l'heure en coulisses, on est un réseau inclusif qui inclut les chercheurs qui travaillent en anglais et en français. Par souci un peu d'équité, je vais faire la présentation en anglais aussi parce que c'est la langue dans laquelle je suis à l'aise. Ensuite, la présentation elle sera donnée en anglais par notre chercheur invité, professeur Mahmoud Fayazi. Puis ensuite, pendant la période de questions, sentez-vous à l'aise de poser la question en français et en anglais parce que Mahmoud, il est habitué à parler les deux langues. Donc, c'est un webinaire qui sera 100% bilingue. Bienvenue aujourd'hui à un webinaire qui va traiter des obstacles et possibilités d'adaptation au changement climatique chez les communautés Mohawk de Kanesatake à Québec. C'est sûr que plusieurs d'entre nous, on s'intéresse aux communautés autochtones et leurs réponses aux inondations. Ça va être aujourd'hui une excellente occasion pour qu'ils nous présentent un peu les résultats de ces recherches. Donc, professeur Fayazi, il a obtenu son doctorat en aménagement de l'Université de Montréal. Il travaille actuellement comme chercheur au centre RISC, R-I-S-C, donc Centre de recherche en innovation en sécurité civile au Québec. Et il est aussi professeur invité à l'École d'architecture de l'Université de Montréal. Ses principaux recherches, il vise à expliquer pourquoi et comment les perturbations environnementales, les pressions des changements climatiques et les interventions post-catastrophes affectent les établissements humains. Dr Fayazi, il a une expérience internationale approfondie, surtout au niveau des changements climatiques. Il a enseigné au niveau de l'évaluation qualitative des risques liés aux risques naturels et aux conséquences des changements climatiques dans l'établissement humain. Il participe actuellement à plusieurs projets de recherche en Asie du Sud, au Moyen-Orient et en Amérique du Nord. Dr Fayazi a présenté les résultats de ses recherches dans un livre, plusieurs articles scientifiques et lors de nombreuses conférences internationales à travers le monde. Et il a parallèlement des activités de recherche et il élabore un cours et enseigne dans différents pays. Je sais qu'il a aussi enseigné en Chine, à Hong Kong, à l'Université Hong Kong, puis au Canada. Donc, je souhaite la bienvenue à professeur Fayazi. Je vous souhaite à toutes et à tous une belle présentation, une bonne écoute. Puis voilà, à toi la parole, Mahmoud.
Alors, merci beaucoup, Manel. Merci pour cette présentation. Oui, je dois d'abord corriger que je ne suis pas le professeur, je suis le professeur invité, mais plutôt que chercheur dans le centre RISC. C'est mon travail temps plein, mon travail principal, c'est un chercheur qui travaille dans le centre RISC. Alors, merci encore pour cette opportunité. C'est vraiment apprécié avec le réseau RISC qui me permettait de présenter les résultats de cette recherche, qui a commencé depuis 2018. C'est un projet très long qui est encore c'est en continuation, mais je vais vous présenter une partie des résultats de ce projet. Alors, avant de commencer de parler de mon projet, j'aimerais aussi expliquer pourquoi cette présentation, ça sera en anglais, parce que cette communauté de Kanesatake, Mohawk Kanesatake, on travaille avec, ils sont plutôt anglophones, mais tous les matériaux qu'on a développés jusqu'à aujourd'hui, c'est plutôt anglophone, et finalement, je suis plus à l'aise de présenter les résultats de ce projet en anglais. Mais n'hésitez pas, si vous avez des questions, commentaires après présentation, on peut toujours discuter en français sans souci. Alors, je vais partager mon écran tout d'abord. Est-ce que vous voyez mon écran? C'est bon? OK, parfait.
Oui, c'est bon.
OK, super. Alors, this presentation is going to be in English. That's why the title is in English also. So the project that I'm going to present today, the title, that is more about the obstacles and opportunities of adaptation to climate change. More specifically, is a result based on the case study that we have done on the Mohawk community of the Kanesatake in Quebec. So as you can see in the logo, the different the organization being involved in this project, including the Centre RISC, Université de Montréal, and also the Réseau RISC, more or less, this project. So, yeah. So, it might be, a bit redundant to give us some, the introductory explication of the climate change adaptation. But I guess for the benefit of those who will listen to this presentation on the YouTube, that might be a bit necessary to give that, the introduction about the climate change adaptation. So that at the beginning of this era of talking about the climate change, all the effort and all the forces being more, directed toward the mitigation. And the mitigation, we put a lot of effort on the mitigation, but at a certain time we arrive to the conclusion that even if we stop, the emission of the greenhouse gases, even today, if we, they're not having any emission and the pollution, but still, that we will have, the negative consequences for the very long time. So that's why that the adaptation became necessary, became the vital, and we have to, at a certain time we understood that we have to shift from mitigation to adaptation. And adaptation is being universally and equally accepted by researchers and practitioners. And but that despite this recognition, despite this globally equal recognition and emphasis on climate change adaptation, researchers discover contextual barriers which alternate adaptation capacities among different nations and the communities. So the discourse around the barriers of the climate change adaptation started, I would say, at the beginning of that this century, in from the 2001, we will see that some literature emerge and talking about the barriers to climate change adaptation. But normally, when they talk about the climate change adaptation, they mostly focus on the 5 main dimensions, which I would say, the budgetary constraints, the unavailable technology, lack of the knowledge, multi-level industrial, the multi-level institutional fragmentation, and more specifically in terms of the social barriers, we talk about the values, different values, belief, and experiences in societies which threaten more often, the adaptation strategies. And also, just recently, we will see that a new, the body of the, literatures emerging, talking about, the political barriers, but mostly in the larger scale. For instance, there are researchers, something like Hofi, Jamili, and there's some more, the famous researchers who try to distinguish 3 fundamental political adaptation barriers. For example, in terms of the the adaptation in terms of the decision makings, in terms of the adaptation global uneven distribution of the vulnerability, those, the discourses that are very in the high, the level of the, the discourse in the higher scales. But what my colleagues and I, we, the noticed is the gap, is the lacune, is the missing of the discourse in terms of the more, the small scales political discourse in terms of the political barriers to climate change adaptation. That's for this reason that we targeted this research, and we we designed this research to understand and to examine barriers to climate change adaptation, mostly in indigenous communities in southern Quebec, who typically suffer from long-standing social political tensions. That's why, you know, as I explained, that's why that we really, since 2018, focused on the Mohawk community of the Kanesatake. And as you see, you know, if you are interested, you can, you know, read the part of the, you know, the result of the research funding being published in the article titled "Barrier to Climate Change Adaptation Indigenous Community," a case of the, you know, the Mohawk community of the Kanesatake. So this, you know, the paper is being published in International Journal of the International Journal of the Disaster Risk Reduction. And but you know, my presentation today is not going to be only focused on what been reported in that paper, but also I'm going to give you a global, you know, the vision, a global, you know, the perspective of the research that you know, that started from you know, the 2018. So as I mentioned, this study, being a longitudinal study, began in the winter of the 2018 when I had the opportunity to teach a course to the master's degree of the urban planning at the McGill University. And then, you know, the more or less we continued this project with my colleagues and with the community members more specifically. And also, you know, as you saw the picture at the bottom, it shows, you know, that the new Grand Chief, Victor Bonesville, participated in our class activities. The picture was taken just recently in December 2022. And, you know, all the time, you know, being involved in this project, either at McGill University or University of Montreal. We designed different courses, different ateliers, different workshops, and the students either in the urban planning and architecture being always involved in this process. So, you know, the different methods that being, you know, applied, you know, since that time. For example, so we have done several site visits. We conducted different informal and unstructured interviews with the Grand Chiefs. Both, you know, the previous Grand Chief, Serge Otzi Simon, and also the newly elected, you know, the Grand Chief is the Chief Victor Bonesville and his colleagues in the band council. We have conducted informal unstructured interviews with several experts who had different responsibilities in the band council, and also an extensive review of the literature and policy documents, and also, you know, the press releases. But before, you know, talking about my research findings, I would like to introduce you a little bit to Kanesatake. I wanted to, you know, to paint the picture a little bit to let you know more, learn, you know, learn more about the realities in Kanesatake, and you know, to understand the Kanesatake from different dimensions. So first of all, in terms of, first of all, in terms of the, you know, the identities, the community and the identities, who you know, that this community are, this community is, you know, the community members of the Kanesatake. I would say that these community members, they identify themselves as I have always a problem pronouncing these names, Haudenosaunee. There are Haudenosaunee, who means there are people who belong to the Long House. They are referred also to the people as Iroquois or Six Nations, which are member of the Confederacy, which called Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which originally made up of the 5 nations living in the northern part of the New York state, and who they, you know, spread. You know, that some of them still stay in the, you know, the U.S. southern side of the, you know, the border. Some move to the Canada, and they are spread all around, you know, the North America. But this community, more specifically, they are very rich in the culture. They are very, the strong identity, and also very strong organizational structure. And also, I would say that, that this population, this community is a very, the live community. The population is the raising and this the population rate is still the increasing. As you see, in the diagram, the population constantly raised since 2005, since the last, the previous census. And as you see, the population today is something about 2,600, the members of this community. And in terms of, their geographical location, you will see that in the map here, you will see that the community is located on the southwest side of the Montreal and more so on the south of the Quebec. And in terms of the proportion of the size of the community, the size of the superficie of this community is about 12 square kilometers, and which is a very tiny percentage of the Quebec's superficie. And the member of the community, as I mentioned, it varies either how do you calculate it? Either the people who live inside the community, there's about 1,783. The people of the community altogether, either who live inside the community or outside of the community, there are 2,007, about 2,666 members of the community. And in terms of the density is about 150 inhabitants who live under every square kilometers. And in terms of the urban morphology of this community, you will see that the pattern is the community who that is organized more or less along the river, along the Ottawa River, and more specifically when the river retreated a little bit to form the lack of the mountain. The community is more concentrated in that area. You will see that on the picture here, you will see that the community mostly is concentrated in that area. And in terms of the form, there is a main road, as you will see, across the community, and also a road that is called Asnenson, which make the crescent around the mountain, and mostly all the the secondary streets avenue, they are perpendicularly organized, meeting the main road. But the one important aspect of this community that we have to be more focused here is the history of the community. The history of the community is very controversial, and we have to be very careful of how to present this history of the community, because it's a point of the controversy between the written non-Indigenous history and the verbal story being presented by the community members. But the version of the written non-Indigenous history of the community is the way that I am going to present it to you. But more, later I will be more, the precise about how the community believe about their history and what's the point of the difference between these two versions of the history. So in terms of the the non-Indigenous written history of the community, it's they believe that the community being created in being located in this region on the 1663 after the creation of the mission of the Lac de Montagne on the island of the Montreal to instruct the native population. This was actually followed by the multiple relocation, but eventually they ended up living in the region that we call it today Kanesatake, and I showed you on the map, which was before that it was their hunting territory. But later on, in the next century, in the 1716, King Louis of France granted 15 square kilometers of the land to the Mohawk, and a similar proportion and similar amount of the land to the Sulpicians. And then the year after, the Sulpician being successfully, they convinced the king to receive the land. Even the land after being allocated to the indigenous community granted to them entirely. So, but all these discussions being happened behind the Mohawk community, and even in 1721, the people of this community concluded that the relocation would be over for this occasion. That they understood from their understanding that this land being assigned to them, infinitely. But for that reason, also, as you see, that's the proofs, the piece of the evidence and the piece of the proof. They waved a wampum built as a sign of the being really finally relocated to this land and the being proprietor of the land. But then later, after 7 years war between the New France and the Britannians, finally, the New France loses the lost the control of its land to the British, and the Sulpicians could not anymore, they claimed their lands, and finally, that they had to leave the land to the King George III. And then later, in the 1854, the land management regime, which called the semi-feudal system of the land tenure used in the North American French colonial empire, so-called the regime seigneurial, ended in 1854. This means, for the Sulpicians, it means the end of the being proprietor of the land, and also it means that the beginning of the fragmentation of the Mohawk territory, because the white people, they start buying the piece of the land from the old seigneurial, the regime from the Sulpicians, and finally the entire land of the community of Kanesatake being bought out, the piece by piece, and the land become fragmented, as you see on the map. And also, another very important event that happened in the history of the Kanesatake is the landslides, the huge landslides that happened in that area, which is a very important event because in that time, in the 1886, the population and the community start planting the pine groves, which is a very important piece of their identity right now. And in 1911, the Sulpicians were granted again the title to the land. This is very long history. I'm not going to the detail, but just to let you know that again in 1911, the Sulpicians were granted the title to the land, and this announcement led them to sell their remaining lands. And they never be able to sell the Mohawks, the lands that the Mohawk community family members live in it. But as much as they could, they sold the lands, and the land became again more fragmented and more fragmented. And in 1945, the federal government began to buy, and bought lands inhabited by the Aboriginal peoples to preserve their territory. And multiple lands claimed followed, by the community, denied by the government at that time for in the very unreasonable delay, I would say about 40, 50, 35 later, all those claims being, denied. And, the people, the community only being proprietor of the lands, being who actually the families lived and otherwise, the land where could be, easily sold by the white people. And in 1989, I'm pretty sure that most of you hear about that event. It's a time of the Oka crisis. The Oka crisis that happened, which strongly mediatized where the Gulf, the company of Gulf, the private Gulf company supported by the town of the Oka wanted to carry out the project of the extension of the cemetery of the community. So all these dynamics that happen in the history of this community, but again, I would emphasize that this view of the history, even though dominates the literature, give very little the voice to the community, and the community. That's not the history that I mentioned to you. There is the absence of the people's voice in this history. But this history that being referred to a lot during on the literature and the law and even on the the courts, and finally give the people of the Kanesatake no legitimate right to the land, as their presence in the region did not predate European presence. This is a reality that we have to take into consideration when we are talking about, the dynamics in Kanesatake. One more important factor that we have to also be aware of, and we have to learn about it before talking about Kanesatake, more in general about the climate change adaptation in Kanesatake, is the existing politics and governance structure in Kanesatake. So that according to Indian Act, after the Indian Act come to the power, come to the enforcement, that all the indigenous communities has to have a band council, which is in the very democratic way to be elected, having elected chiefs and the community and the band council members to being entitled and receive federal government support. So election of the chief and member of the Kanesatake band council under an election system began since 1991. And the band council became responsible for the health, education, culture, housing, employment, social welfare, and economic development of the community. But the important factor here is that and the indigenous communities, more in general, the reserve, and also more specifically in case of the Kanesatake, there is no property tax income, there is no tax income, and the community for their their management system and for their institutional system, they are all dependent on the designated funds from particular the federal government's programs. And also one more important factor here is that in 2001, the government adopted there is a the time of the adoption of the Kanesatake Interim Land-Based Government Act, which is a bit strange because despite governing by the band council, which is in accordance with the Indian Act, the community lands do not have the reserve status. Okay, do not forget that this community that doesn't have a the reserve status, and the land that is being the mercy of the federal government who bought that this land for and to preserve this lands for the community. So the proprietor of the land is still federal government, not the community itself. But they have the right to, as I mentioned, to use the land, to utilize the land, to live on it, and for their all that and even to manage the land. But this the complexity still exists because they are not the proprietor of the land, and also there is a lack of the reserve status still, in the community, which makes the situation more complicated and more bizarre. And also, despite the adoption of the Kanesatake Interim Land-Based Government Act in 2001, land management remain still ambiguous. But why is this, what is this, the Interim Land-Based Government Act, and what's the, the advantage and disadvantage, and what is the, the limit? So, as I mentioned, the territory is bought by the federal government and is reserved for the Mohawk community, which is clearly, mentioned and written on this interim land-based government. Sorry. And that the community, this act gives the right to the community of Kanesatake to legislate in the land use and the development of the community territory. And also it gives extended competence in several areas to this community. For example, the protection management of the wildlife and the fish resources, respect for the law, maintenance of the orders, and construction and transformation of the building. All those, that the competences being extended to the community after, the adoption of this act, which called Kanesatake Interim Land-Based Government Act since 2001. And a little, talking about the climate change to have a better picture of the Kanesatake and its climate conditions. So I refer to the Uranus, the climate projections, which I'm pretty sure that all of you are familiar with this, the excellent works of the Uranus in terms of the climate change simulation and expectations. So as you can see here, the Kanesatake is located on this red light here, very on the bottom of the Laurentine region. So in the Laurentine region, you will see, on the bottom is the Kanesatake, and in terms of the, the climate change expectations and projections, you will see how in different areas, for example, since 2020, from the 2020, 2041, 2070, the different, the projections, I would say that is a medium, the average projection of the Uranus. It will be about 9.4 degrees warmer. And also, if we go a bit further until the 2100, it's going to be about 12 degrees. The temperature increase is going to be 12 degrees warmer, an average annual temperature, which means that it's going to be, associated with a major increase of, the occurrence of the extreme events, increase in the health problem to the heat, and also for sure it's going to impact the life of the fauna and flora, which this indigenous communities are very strongly, their life and their welfare is dependent on this, the nature and the ecosystems. And also, in terms of the annual frost index, you will see that the south of the Laurentine is going to be very highly affected, and about 3 times less. That the frost period is going to be in the projection of the 2100 is going to be 3 times less intense than today. And even though it might be opportunity for the more agricultural activities, but again, it's going to have a negative impact on flora. And in terms of the, the heat waves and in terms of the canicule, which usually be calculated in terms of the number of the nights about 22 degrees Celsius, we will see that by the end of the century, about until 2100 is going to have be about 28.5 nights of the warm nights, about 22 degrees Celsius and above, which is going to to be very serious, the problems in terms of the ventilation, natural ventilation, and also for the vulnerable peoples who are less resistant to heat. And in terms of the precipitation, which are, the main, the reason main that we can blame these two factors for, the spring floods, you will see that it's going to be very dramatic increase in terms of the precipitation in form of the rain. You will see that the south of the the Laurentine, more specifically where the Kanesatake is located, is one of the rainiest region in the Laurentine, which is the equivalent of the increase of the 13 to 24% increase of the rain in the projection of the the 2100. And it's going to be the increase in terms of the water saturated soil. So more and more over the time, the soil is going to be more saturated, less the penetrable, and the more the possible more the possible for the the flood that will happen. And in terms of the snow, even though the snow, they're going to be, the precipitation in terms of the snow is going to be less and less, but the snow melt is going to happen in the faster, in the rapid pace, and the accumulation of the rain and the snow melt, which is the main cause of the the spring flood, which means that we must be waiting and being expecting having more spring floods in the future. Again, coming back to more context specific, the discussion of Kanesatake, you will see that inundation and flood are very common, the events in Kanesatake, and the more or less inundation and floods are spring, the spring events, in this community, more or less every year that experience this flood. And based on our findings, we, and our survey, we understood that there are about 30 buildings are, directly located in the flood zone in this community. And about those 30 buildings, 20 are private residents. About 10 other, the buildings that are secondary residents, chalet, and sometimes, the small factories. But 20 of those are private residents, and the people are still living in those with the very precarious conditions and very, in terms of the health, very unhealthy condition that they live in this. And in the most of the cases, even with a very minor degree of the inundation and the flood, those households have to evacuate their houses because they're very located in the very vulnerable, the situation and the flood plain zones. In terms of the 2017 and 2019 floods, as I mentioned, and again, it's going to be probably redundant information for most of you, but you will now, you perfectly know that the winter of the 2017 was the fourth warmest winter since 1948, and the accumulation of the snow and rain was the second and third highest respectively in the 50 years before the events. And the accumulation of the higher than normal precipitation plus quicker melting process of the snow cover caused severe floods in April and May 2017. Which is the almost common phenomenon after this, the flood that happened all over the, the Quebec and partially in Ontario as well. So this, the event of the flood affected several municipalities and communities across Quebec, and among all those communities, the Mohawk community of Kanesatake was severely affected and faced many hurdles, I would say, during the emergency and recovery process. For example, many citizens had to temporarily relocate in 2017. And surprisingly, even if you visit this community, you will see that many of those houses are still, the distracted and still, their residents, their, the households living on temporary shelters in the form of the containers and the very small units of the families live in. So the community and many, the volunteers, I would say right after the floods in 2017, 2019, community members, people from the neighboring communities, and even people from their sister communities. I would say that when we talk about the Mohawk community, there is 3 sister communities: Kanesatake, Mohawk, and Akbasasne. These 3 communities, they are sister community. Whatever happened to each of them, they're being, the besieged to help each other. So at the time of the flood in 2017 and 2019, many volunteers, they jumped and they rushed into helping this community, and they mobilized all the resources and the efforts, either in terms of the sandbagging, in terms of the providing hot food, warm food, the clothing, and every day, the necessary goods that they needed during the period of the emergency. They were very successful, I would say, in terms of the first response to the flood. But despite the reaction of the community to the emergency phase of the disaster, the recovery process appears to have been a bit challenging. In answer to our interview questions, based on our personal observation during 2019 floods, 2 years after the 2017, we found, that as I mentioned, that the recovery process were still ongoing since 2017, and even still, if you go to Kanesatake, the walk in the small alleys, you will see that there are houses being affected by the floods and not having the chance and opportunity of being renovated and repaired. And finally, the houses had to, evacuated, and the need of the permanent housing is still there. They still are, they're looking for the support for the construction of their permanent houses. So and sometimes you will see that there are small trailers, being parked on the alleys, and the households being relocated from their destructed houses and are still living on those trailers. So, but that was a bit of the introduction about the Kanesatake, which was necessary to give before talking about the barriers of mostly political barriers, or progression of the barriers, as I call it, to climate change adaptation. And in fact, my research, that part of the research, the being published recently, is focused more on understanding, how these barriers being created and constructed during the time, and how by the end these barriers emerge and they push the community to the state of the vulnerability, to be vulnerable to climate change, not being able to reduce the risk of the future disaster, but also not being able perfectly to respond and recover from those disasters. To understand that dynamic, my colleagues and I, we relied more on the discourse of the vulnerability. The concept of vulnerability, I would say. The discourse of vulnerability, in fact, has a rich and long history in research on poverty and entitlement, food security, and more in general on environmental change. With respect to climate change, there are many researchers who previously incorporated social and contextual factors into discourse of the vulnerability. And the context-sensitive understanding of the vulnerability, in fact, argue that vulnerability does not simply happen on assets or capacity of individuals or group who and also the vulnerability is not only the capacity of the individual or group, yet it produces an experience through historical, political events from the local to the global. Eventually, we're being inspired by this understanding of the vulnerability, and by borrowing the basic concept of the pressure and release model of the vulnerability. Probably some of you are familiar with that in the being introduced by Wisner and his colleagues, and about the 1990, that they introduced this concept of the the pressure and release, the model of the vulnerability, which shows the progress of the vulnerability creation. And we also, my colleagues and I, being inspired by that understanding. And this, our research develops the model of the progression of the barrier to climate change adaptation, which illustrates the process of the barrier creation and their outcomes. For example, this what you see in this in the slides is a hypothetical, the illustration of this model, the hypothetical model that illustrates the relationship among the historical tensions, which you see here in this column. Long-standing tensions is the historical tensions. Their consequence challenges. You will see that these long-standing tensions lead to consequent pressures and barriers in different categories and their outcomes, which are residual vulnerabilities to climate change and climate-driven disasters. This model, in fact, illustrates how barriers to climate change adaptation trace back to historical challenges, which eventually reduce communities' capacity and increase their vulnerability during a long period of time. We use very hypothetical, the examples here in this model, as you see, to better explain, how the functionality of this model. We would say that this is our, the assumptions, but sometimes the links that we created being, proved by different researchers in the different part of the, the research. But in general, for example, I will give you an example how this model works, and then we are going to see how we apply this model in the case of the Kanesatake. You will say that indigenous peoples drastically decline after contacting with European, as they had no biological and cultural adaptation to epidemics that being, that the European brought to the North America, mostly as a souvenir for the indigenous community, something like a smallpox, the tuberculosis, the scarlet fever, influenza. So the population, indigenous population, drastically being declined since that time. At the beginning of when they meet Europeans for the first time. So the wave of the epidemics, the depopulated the indigenous communities and eventually undermined their power, and and cleared the way for the colonization and repression that followed then after. And following the population decline, government and the churches colonized the weakened indigenous communities, which resulted in the even more repression of their spirituality, education, cultural practices, and land and resource assets. As an example, we would refer to the establishment of the residential schools at the beginning of the 19th century. And this situation paved the way for more spiritual and cultural influence on the indigenous communities, and then is which we can call it about, that's something like that we can call it that as a part of the consequent pressures. And finally, being reported by the many researchers, this residential schools assimilation policies, this allowed First Nation children from speaking their language, aiming to that disconnect the children from their cultural practices, and eventually leaving the kids in the limbo of not belonging to neither the indigenous nor settler society, and finally, the being suffered by the abuse, in some cases died to the disease, and weak healthcare systems, and overcrowded residential schools. But this altogether, the accumulation of all this situation ended up, the creation of the certain barriers to climate change, something, the discriminatory access to the resources, lack of the budget, lack of the knowledge, all those, the constraints that unavailable, that disabled this community to have the adequate knowledge and technology and even confidence in terms of the fighting against climate change, despite all traditional knowledge that they possess, and they ended up by being vulnerable to climate change impacts. So at that time, this was very hypothetical scenario. We created this hypothetical scenario to see how our model, the model of the progression of the barrier to climate change works. And then we applied this model in Kanesatake, and we began the finding and taking different evidence from everywhere by talking with the people, with the administration, with the grand chief, and also the observation, collecting all the information. But we understood some interesting facts that over the time approved and proved our model of the progression of the barriers to climate change adaptation. So the history of Kanesatake, as I told you, is written by Euro-Canadian and mostly the non-indigenous, is that the community came into existence when the seminary of the San Sulpice established a mission in 1721 in the north shore of the Lac de Montagne, the lake of the two mountains, if we translate it in English. On the other hand, the people of the Kanesatake argue that the land was occupied long before by their ancestors, and even before the seminary arrived. For that purpose, for that, to argue, they have, some evidence. They said that, that they have some words, some vocabularies on their oral history, on their oral, the stories, and also sometimes they found some evidence, some historical evidence. This view of the history, as I said, dominate the literature and give the people of the Kanesatake no legitimate right to the land, as their presence in the region did not predate European presence. And since the beginning of the 20th century, Kanesatake restricted access to the lands really ignited, the fire up, the frequent conflicts over the land ownership with the Sulpicians. And to resolve this conflict, the government, as I mentioned previously, in previous slides, began to, remediate, began to intervene, and began to buy a piece of the lands and from the private owners on behalf of the Kanesatake communities since 1945. And by having this complexities and having this, the dynamic, you will see some important, the facts. So it's important, the facts said by the previous Grand Chief Simon. It says that if we move, we have to abandon and rise to the land under the territory. This, the phrase struck me. It says that, so they are living in the very, very tiny, the territory. And if eventually the water rise and the territory, the shrank, they have no other territory. They have no other land to move to. Okay, so eventually, if they have to relocate, they have to abandon the right to the land. Okay, it's very important to understand. And this says that any relocation strategy is impracticable. So there's no way to relocate. They have to stay. They have to be there. And even, the nature, the water is going to claim their lands eventually, slowly, but still there is no way out. They are prisoned there. They have no choice unless they have to abandon their right to the land. And another piece of this puzzle, which is very important to understand, is that this devastating and we would say that the physical and emotional wreckage that caused by the armed force during the Oka crisis we would say that in 1990s has left scars in the Kanesatake community as well as other indigenous communities across Canada. How did that impact the community's vulnerability is the fact that whenever that the army approached to offer help, to offer the assistance during the floods, community rejected. The community immediately rejected, and they said that no, that's a reminder of the the dark days. And in the first day of the flooding in May 2017, the Canadian Army Force assistance the Canadian Army offered assistance in sandbagging and the normal support that they offer to either non-Indigenous and Indigenous communities, but the offer immediately was rejected by the Kanesatake, which is something very important to take. They feel isolated, they feel not being supported, and even when the support approach, they feel betrayed. Okay, that's also one barrier that we noticed. And there's something else is in terms of the ambiguity of our orders and interjurisdictional fragmentations. Okay, I must explain it a little bit more in detail. So this ambiguity of the order and institutional fragmentations prevented effective communication, even very simple communication, such as the issue of the life-saving notification regarding the opening of the upstream floodgates and the risk of the extreme water level rise. Okay, again, according to Grand Chef Simon, he says that if the management of the dam notified the council, the Mohawk Council of the Kanesatake, a bit earlier, and even they notified them at all, the emergency efforts could have been stepped up to mitigate the additional flow of the water. So the story is that, the dam management, okay, on the upstream of the river, eventually decided to open the water gates at a certain time. But before that, the opening that, they notified all the municipalities, communities around, that region, around the river, around the lake, to notify them, to announce them, the heads up that the gates is going to be open, and that they more or less they get ready, the buffer time that they have. But because of the lack of this institutional, I would say that this institutional fragmentation and this lack of the communication, the Kanesatake community never been notified, never been the addressed, and and over the time over the night they're being surprised by the sudden water level rise that they encountered in 2017. Therefore, opening the Carillon Dam floodgates plus the extreme climate event caused an unprecedented surge of the water level by about 20 feet on the shoreline of the Kanesatake in early May 2017. This left the Kanesatake residents no chance to prepare in real time for the increasing level of the water into their community. So as you see in this, the diagram, you will see that on the provincial level, so there is an order of the, the institutional order. Okay, there is a jurisdictional order. The provincial government is a local authority. It could be either in the shape of the MRC and then municipalities, but because indigenous communities, the lands, I would say that more specifically, the indigenous community of Kanesatake, because the land owned by the federal government, so they're direct responsible is the federal government, and sometimes there is no direct communication with provincial government authorities and local authorities with Kanesatake. So I would say that it's an important factor in terms of their vulnerability. There is an institutional fragmentation, more specifically in terms of the ambiguity of the order and interjurisdictional fragmentations. And this,
Conclusion,
yes.
please. Thank you.
The time is, sorry. Yes, so should I stop?
Conclusion, like 2 minutes of conclusion?
Sure. Yes, this is my final slide here. Okay, so as you can see, that we applied this model to the longest standing tension of the showing how this adaptation process, this political barrier to climate change adaptation process happened over the time. That's having a longest standing tension, which was a conflictual history of the Mohawk of Kanesatake, and then happened, that the consequence of the lack of the secure land tenure and ambiguity of the order and the interjurisdictional fragmentation, which cause barriers to climate change adaptation, which I name it through my presentation, and also eventually we will see the negative outcomes in terms of the vulnerability, which unable to retreat from the flood-prone zone areas, rejection of the emergency assistance, and so on and so forth. And that's and I invite the audience that if they're interested to learn more about this research, the paper that I introduced at the beginning that could be main source of the learning more about this research. And thank you so much. And I'm very sorry about the exceeding the time.
Thank you, Mahmoud. It was very interesting. Thank you for this nice presentation. Is there any questions? Est-ce que vous avez des questions pour Mahmoud? Oui. Mélie? Oui, Mélie, vas-y. Bonjour.
Bonjour, and thank you very much, Professor, for this very interesting presentation. I had two questions for you. The first one is, how was the process to get in touch with the Kanesatake people? I think I have never been in touch with indigenous communities in Canada, and I was wondering how is it like in terms of ethics, etc., for researching with these collectivities. And and then the other one was you mentioned, and it's really interesting, institutional fragmentation, ambiguities, and to manage flood risks and flood exposure, then you need a certain level of decision-making leverage around managing your assets, stormwater management, etc. So how is it similar or different from what is happening with Quebec's municipalities? What would maybe one or two main differences that could be really specific to their capacity to manage their own assets in the community? Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Very, very pertinent question, I would say. I know that the first answer to your question is in this slide and the picture that I show you here. So you see, I really been involved, in this community activities. That's me, being, the volunteering, sandbagging, and that during the flood in 2019. I really been involved, helping the community, talking with them, participating on the powwow, their ceremonies, and trying to, as much as possible, build a link. Okay, but I should also, acknowledge the importance of the relationship of being built over the time. I would say that maybe in the last 10 or 15 years, that when my colleagues, Dr. Isabel Bisson, who is a co-author of my paper, and this community, and she really facilitated this relationship, and the community had I would say that the 100% trust on her, and then have the confidence on me, because I was introduced to the community by a person who the community know her before and had the trust and confidence on her. So that's the answer to your first question. The second question, I would say that it's a really, the small community, and the institutional, the structure of the community is very also small. As a, the band council, there are some the portfolio. So portfolio, we said that is a department, a small department, who every department take care of the different aspects of the community. So they have the portfolio manager of the emergency management and disaster management person who deals with the situation and the physical condition. So I would say that in the rural, in the common the structure, institutional structure, I would say, in the different municipalities, of course there is a urban planning department. There is the service de sécurité civile, which is mostly in charge of the managing a disaster and emergencies, but those institutional factors are missing in Kanesatake for several reasons, because there is inadequate, probably the budget, and also the unclear responsibilities, and also no contact and relationship, and not having that jurisdictional order very clear. So that organization are very I would say that sometimes ad hoc, and also unorganized, and always very dependent to the federal government.
Thank you, Mahmood. Thank you, Meli, for your question. Do we have other questions? So if you don't, so for sure we will send you the recording on our YouTube channel. It will be available on our YouTube channel. And also I send you on the chat the link for the article presented at the beginning of this presentation. Merci à toutes et à tous. On vous souhaite un excellent vendredi, une excellente fin de semaine. On vous retrouve le 2 février. Valérie, le 2?
Le 10.
Le 10 février, avec une présentation de Maître...
Monsieur Girard.
Oui, Maître Girard, une présentation sur la réglementation de la zone inondable. Donc, si vous êtes intéressé par tous les aspects juridiques, vous serez les bienvenus. Puis, merci d'être resté 10 minutes après. Je vous souhaite un excellent vendredi.